In the military spectacular, the International Air to Two, presented by Julian, Tutt and Raymond Baxter.
75 years ago, on April the 1st, 1918 to be precise, the Royal Air Force was born. But I wonder what its great father figure, Lord Trenchard, and his gallant pilots of 3/4 of a century ago would have said had they seen what you and I are looking at now. You join me in a Hawk advanced jet trainer of number 74, the famous Tiger Squadron, now part of 4 FTS at Valley in Anglesey, flown by Flight Lieutenant Tony Dalton, call sign Tiger 3. Beside and behind us, 19 identical aircraft at 1,500 feet and getting on for 300 knots. The whole formation is led by Wing Commander Martin Stoner, the chief instructor at Valley. Together, we write in the sky the figure 75 to celebrate that anniversary. And within that celebration, we shall trace, as best we may, the history of the Royal Air Force.
From 30 countries, including 14 display teams, have assembled in the heart of the Gloucestershire countryside to join in the anniversary celebration. Welcome to RAF Fairford and International Air to Tu-93, the largest air show ever staged in the history of aviation. During the weekend, 400,000 spectators will have watched over 20 hours of flying displays and a myriad of shows on the ground. For the next 90 minutes, we'll bring you the very best of IAT 93.
Well, it seems that to present aviation programmes, you have to introduce them from the air, and I didn't want to be the only one left on the ground. So join me later when I'll be looking at all the fun of the fair from around 500 feet.
The show is in aid of the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund, and its president, His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent, has already visited. In the new spirit of friendship, he met the Russian crew who'd arrived in the star of the show, the Bear, of which we see more later. We'll also show you their colleagues' dramatic display in the MiG-29s that ended spectacularly and thankfully without serious injury. But in the RAF's 75th year, let its international ambassadors weave their magical patterns in the sky, the Red Arrows. For the Red Arrows, the shape of the RAF's next generation of strike aircraft, the EFA, and from that into a Lancaster bomber in tribute to the wartime pilots who brought home their crippled aircraft, a starboard engine on fire.
Clear to launch. Skip! Left. No.
5-4 split and cross. followed by the fan and split. It's worth noting that the team leader, squadron leader Adrian Thurley, is flying his 500th display with the Red Arrows. Display to thrill their predecessors, those early pilots who belonged either to the Royal Naval Air Service or the Army's Royal Flying Corps. It wasn't until 1918 that, after lengthy campaigning by Lord Trenchard, the two arms combined to form the Royal Air Force. Even the inspirational Trenchard could never have anticipated how his baby would develop. From string wing to swing wing, 75 years on, the Brill Cream boys of the 90s talk about multi-royal combat aircraft, fly at twice the speed of sound, and don't even have to see their targets. But allow former wartime Spitfire pilot Raymond Baxter to tell you the story.
We start with the trainers, and this is the famous Avro 504. When A.V. Rowe built the first one in 1913, he told a friend that he thought he'd be lucky if he sold 6. In all, over 10,000 504s were built. As both bomber and fighter, it was outstandingly successful in the First World War. But regardless of its equipment, no Air Force is better than its training. The establishment of Central Flying School at Uphaven in 1916 transformed learning to fly from a hit or miss basis to a scientific discipline. And by 1917, the 504 was the standard British trainer. Production continued until 1933, and many great names of the Second World War learnt to fly on this aeroplane designed in 1913, the beloved Avro 504.
But this aircraft, the de Havilland Tiger Moth, was specifically designed as a two-seat trainer for the RAF. It overlapped and succeeded the Avro, winning for itself the title the Empire's trainer. The magazine Flight reported on November the 13th, 1931, the first batch was recently delivered to No. 3 Flying Training School, and others are coming along. Indeed they were. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the Tiger was the ab initio trainer of the RAF, and when the Empire Air Training Scheme was launched, thousands of volunteer aircrew cadets found a Tiger waiting for them in South Africa, Rhodesia, Canada or Australia. And here's another contemporary of the Tiger, designed for precisely the same purpose, the Miles Magister. The Berkshire family business of Miles Aircraft, founded in the 20s, built all its aircraft in wood. One reason why so few are still flying. It wasn't the wood that failed over the years, it was the glue. In its day, it was the only monoplane approved by the Air Ministry for ab initio instruction, and 1,293 were built between 1937 and 1941. But almost all successful aircrew cadets of my generation got to fly this, the North American AT-6, the Harvard. The fact is, it trained more Allied pilots than any other type in the Second World War. Curiously, that issue of flight in 1931 also referred to familiarity with the noise of a bigger engine. Apposite in this case. When you wound it up, the tips of the Harvard's propeller went supersonic, and the resultant snarl attracted the attention of girlfriends the world over and infuriated beyond speech their parents. Oh well, times have changed. Or have they? The name de Havilland is one writ large in the history of the RAF, and this aircraft inherited the mantle and role of the Tiger Moth, the de Havilland Canada Chipmunk. Throughout the 50s and 60s, it was the standard first solo aeroplane at every RAF elementary flying training school. Every bit as important was its service to the re-emergence of the Volunteer Reserve and the University Air Squadrons, and the Chipmunk is still in service flying today. But now the RAF needed a purpose-built jet trainer. This was their first, the BAC Jet Provost, or JP for short, a huge improvement on its predecessor, the Piston Provost. First delivery was in June 1959, maximum level speed 440 miles an hour. Over 450 JPs were built, and they marked a significant chapter in the development of the RAF trainer. Like the Royal Navy, the RAF believes in continuing its great names. This is the present-day Bulldog, two-seat, side-by-side trainer named after the famous fighter of the 30s. In 1968, the Beagle Company designed a military version of their two-seat Beagle pup, and the fully aerobatic Bulldog first flew in May 1969. 200 horsepower flat 4 Lycoming piston engine, the Bulldog runs about happily at up to 150 miles an hour with a range of 620 miles. And here's the newest recruit to the ranks of the RAF trainers, the Shorts Tucano, which came into service only 3 years ago. The RAF's first single-engine turboprop, and its first design ever to be bought from South America from Embraer of Brazil. It won in 1985 the fierce competition to replace the Jet Provost. Shorts of Belfast were given the job of bringing it up to RAF requirements and then manufacturing it. And Shorts built the T Mark I in December 1986. And finally, in our review of trainers, the Hawk, originally Hawker Siddeley, now British Aerospace, arguably the best of the bunch to date. From its first appearance at Farnborough in 1976, flown by Duncan Simpson, it has been an outstanding success, not only in display, either solo or in formation, but as a hard-working, exciting, advanced tactical jet. But there are other ways to get your kicks in the air.
I think this is it! I'm really not too sure what I've let myself in for here. It's an incredible feeling. So beautiful being up here. Somebody said it was like having a ride on a magic carpet. I've been assured that this and these straps will keep me strapped in. So there's no danger of falling out. Fingers crossed. I think we're in for a little treat now. I'm not sure if I'm going to like this. Woo! Wow! Woo! Hey! Woo! It's an incredible feeling. I feel exhausted. Woo! Hey! Hey! It's amazing! Woo! Wow!
We're now lining up on Fairford runway is one of the most powerful visitors to this year's IAT, the German Navy's Tornado IDS. These two Turbo Union RB199 turbofans produce 16,075 pounds of thrust when the reheat is engaged, launching the Tornado to 30,000 feet in less than 2 minutes from brakes off. This particular Tornado is normally based at Eggebek with Marienfliegergeschwader 2, where it performs the anti-shipping strike role and can be armed with the Cormoran missile. A nice slow pass with the undercarriage down. Camouflage pattern normally blends the Tornado into the Baltic and North Sea skies. I say it seems to be doing a pretty good job on a typically British summer's afternoon. And an incredibly short stopping distance of a little over 1,000 feet, even in the wet. And as the Tornado powers away, we continue the international flavour with this visitor from Sweden, the Saab JA-37 Viggen.
Viggen, the surface wind is 240 degrees, 8 knots, and you are clear takeoff on display.
Clear takeoff, there we go.
dramatic-looking aircraft that was designed to be operated from roads in Scandinavia with limited space for takeoff and landing. For those who struggle with the niceties of aircraft recognition, the double delta wing arrangement makes the Viggen instantly identifiable. The JA version is designed primarily for air defence and has 6 air-to-air missiles, either Skyflash or Sidewinder, and a 30mm Oerlikon cannon. The Swedish Air Force has a total of 330 in service. This one, being flown by Major Jan Freud, is from F4 Wing at Östersund in northern Sweden. And another international visitor, the F-16. As a firm wartime ally, the 3 Dutch squadrons were assimilated into the RAF, and today they retain those numbers. This F-16A is from number 311 Squadron. The F-16 is a highly agile fighter, and if this looks impressive, when pushed it can withstand twice the G he's pulling here. The slow spin demonstrates the aircraft's superb handling characteristics, which have made it a firm favourite with pilots in 18 countries who fly more than 3,800 F-16s which have been built to date. Production continues at Fort Worth in Texas and at a new factory in Turkey. The Dutch use an Irvine 23-foot diameter parachute as well as aerodynamic braking to keep the aircraft's landing performance short.
RAF fighters and fighter pilots have added a lustre and romance as rich as any to the legend and achievements of the past 75 years. And this is the beautiful Gloucester Gladiator, the last of the great line of RAF biplane single-seat fighters. 840 horsepower Bristol 9-cylinder radial engine, 4 fixed .303 machine guns, top speed 250 miles an hour. It marked, I suppose, the end of the Biggles era, and inspired in their boyhood the generation who were to fight the Second World War, including myself. Its prototype flew in 1934, but in fact Gladiators were operational at home and abroad from September the 3rd, 1939, by no means least in the early days of the Siege of Malta, where one of the pilots of Faith, Hope and Charity was Jim Pickering. Which one did you fly, Jim?
We flew all 3. We didn't have our own aircraft. It was change round.
And you were flying other airplanes as well at the time?
That's right, and Hurricanes.
How did you compare the Gladiator with the Hurricane?
Much more manoeuvrable, of course. Lovely aircraft to fly.
Quite apart from anything else, you were outgunned and always went up to meet the attack.
Yes, well, a fighter squadron, that's what you're there for. It's a defensive arm, and you're not really outgunned by the number of guns because it only wants one gun to be successful.
But no names are written more proudly in the history of the Royal Air Force than these, the Hurricane and Spitfire, symbolic of the Battle of Britain, preserved and operated by the Memorial Flight.
both powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, one of the most important single factors in the Allied victory in the air of World War II, and both arrived in the nick of time. The Hawker Hurricane, which first flew in 1935, came first thanks to the drive and initiative of Sir Sidney Cam and his team, and in fact in the Battle of Britain its 8.303 machine guns destroyed more enemy aircraft than all the other defences put together. But R.J. Mitchell's masterpiece, the Vickers Supermarine Spitfire, which first flew in 1936, unlike the Hurricane, was developed and modified in mark after mark from 1 to 24, each for a specific role. The Hurricane was quicker into service, but the Spitfire remained a frontline fighter until finally replaced by the jets years after the war. In all, some 23,000 Spitfires and Seafires were built, but numbers are not significant.
The main object of the International Air Tattoo is to raise money for the RAF's Benevolent Fund. It's a charity which was set up to help past and present servicemen and women and their families. It's been going for 74 out of the RAF's 75 years. 3 years ago, 22-year-old Rob Lewis broke his back in a gymnastics accident while he was training to be an aircraft engineer at RAF Halton. He's paralysed from the waist down. But thanks to help from the Benevolent Fund, Rob was able to continue his training and fulfil his childhood ambition of learning to fly. The fund has a scholarship scheme for teaching disabled people to fly. That took Rob to America. The training aircraft used are specially modified to cope with all kinds of disabilities, and today Rob's the proud possessor of a private pilot's license.
The Benevolent Fund have been very good to me. For a start, they bought the wheelchair that I use at the moment, everyday one, because it's far lighter than an NHS wheelchair. And they contributed money towards the car that I use. They've helped me to go to America to fly, and they're helping me to buy a basketball wheelchair as well. They've been very good to me.
Tell me about the flying.
It's always been, although I was training to be an engineer in the Air Force, I would have hoped to have moved on to become a pilot. And although the piloting I can do now is limited, it's helped me to do what I wanted to do to some extent, where I thought it would already been out of my reach.
What's it like being up in the air?
It's on your own. It's great. It gives you the chance to get away, really away from everything, and especially at night when it's so quiet and calm, you can fly along. And you can rely on yourself as well. And whilst you're in the air, the disability doesn't count at all. Once you're sat in the aircraft, you can fly as well as anyone else, really.
Of its equipment, the greatest single turning point in the history of the Royal Air Force was, of course, the dawn of the jet age at the end of the Second World War. And the first Allied jet to fly operationally 8 days before the German Messerschmitt Me-262 was the Gloucester Meteor. It first flew in March 1943 and joined 616 Squadron on the 12th of July 1944.
The Meteors are driven by 2 rocket-like engines through which air is sucked in at a tremendous rate, compressed, heated, and then ejected through the turbines and nozzles at the rear.
From that aura of mystique, the Meteor went on to fulfill many roles: advanced dual training, night fighting and long-range reconnaissance. Almost 4,000 were built, but sadly no Meteor is still flying today. The Vampire first flew as the DH-100 in September 1943, went into production in April 1945 and was delivered the following December. It had all the hallmarks of classic de Havilland practice and was the world's first airplane to be designed specifically to exploit the advantages of the jet engine. And that single engine was the Goblin centrifugal turbojet of 3,000 pounds, presented on a plate by the Attlee government to both the Americans and the Russians, of which both took swift and full advantage. The Vampire and its variants were hugely successful. The RAF's next jet fighter was the Hawker Hunter. It first flew in 1951 and Bill Bedford became its first chief test pilot.
Beautiful aeroplane with Sidney Cam's design and mark on it. 4 powerful 30mm cannons, a wide track undercarriage forgiving to, you know, the most agricultural type of pilot in the cockpit, and an aeroplane with a big wing and a high thrust to weight ratio. And of course it became a real pilot's aeroplane.
Bill Bedford's Hunter displays were brilliant, and one in particular became legendary.
I'd just come hot from Farnborough, where I was right up to speed on display flying with a unique characteristic that we wanted to demonstrate, namely a smoking spin with a swept-wing aeroplane which had never been done in public before. The unorthodox let-down aerobatic display flowed freely. Then I motored along the runway at maximum speed, switched on this powerful smoke generation system, pulled up, zoomed to at full throttle to 18,000 feet. Then it was stick hard back, full left rudder, full out spin aileron. The airplane just flicked upwards a few turns and then settled down in a steady vertical spin. My minimum recovery altitude, 6,000 feet. That gave me 1,000 feet for my wife and family. I took recovery action. I let it go down to treetop level, pulled up, did a roll, circuit landing, stepped out of the cockpit, smiled as if it was part of my normal display, and never told anyone about it till 18 years later.
Certainly the most revolutionary aircraft acquired by the RAF to date, the Harrier, now British Aerospace and McDonnell Douglas. This GR5 is from 20 Squadron, flown by Flight Lieutenant Rob Lee. He and his Harrier colleagues owe a tremendous amount to former Chief Test Pilot John Farley, who took over the long, hard job of developing the Harrier from Bill Bedford's pioneer work, and has done more than any other single individual to make the Harrier what it is today. What, I wondered, was his worst moment?
The French Navy at one stage were going to have our aeroplane because they had no jet fighter that they thought was safe to fly from their decks at night. I wanted to show the French that additionally, when they got more used to it, they would be having an aeroplane which had got great flexibility. And so after our job was done, on the next day I said to the ship's captain, I said, just one thing I'd like to show you is the flexibility of the airplane. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I'd like to take off and you try and stop me landing on your ship. And so I took off and I watched this ship and he threw a hard left turn and he threw the anchor out, and this was in the Bay of Biscay and it was quite rough, and so this boat's just wallowing, you know, across the swell in the Bay of Biscay. And then he fires up all his smoke and he lays all that in a great cloud across the deck, and it's just a mess. And about 5 seconds after I landed, it wallowed to the right, and now I'm looking down here, and with the brakes on, this thing is just sliding across this wet deck, you see, and there's French sailors coming with ropes and chains and things. Next thing I know is it's rolling the other way, and it's sliding backwards, and I'm having to play the nozzles, you know, reverse thrust and forward thrust, trying to hold this thing on the flight deck. Having done my bit, I thought it was up to the Navy to grab the airplane then, but they didn't see it that way, and so I think that was probably the worst moment.
But I know there were many nasty moments in the serious business of exploring and developing the extraordinary capabilities of the world's first operational jump jet. When that great father figure of British aviation, Sir Tom Sopwith, watched it for the first time, he said, "Now I've seen everything." And those capabilities won its spurs for the Harrier in the Falklands War, and are well suited to the potential challenges of our troubled world today. For 20 years, those charged with the air defense of Great Britain heeded the frequent call to scramble, which meant another Soviet intruder high above the North Sea. Invariably, it was the Russian Bear, but the only shooting was the whir of intelligence cameras. But when the call to scramble went up earlier this week, the welcoming committee was a friendly one, as the Bear was invited to land for the first time after thousands of visits in the past 30 years. A man with a particular interest in flying machines Russian is Jane's aviation expert, Paul Beaver.
Well, high above the North Sea, a Tornado F-3 from 43 Squadron met this Bear H strategic bomber. Piloting the Bear was Major General Anatoly Solovyev, the long-range aviation deputy commander in Russia. He's a veteran of 17 years of probing the UK air defence region. And although the West calls this Tupolev bomber the Bear, the Russians know it as the Tu-95MS, and there's its rear gunner. Here, approaching Fairford's 11,000-foot runway, General Solovyev reported there was no tension on the flight deck, just excitement. And those main wheels, by the way, are 5 feet in diameter. The Bear had flown for nearly 5 hours from an airbase just outside Moscow, but it could have stayed in the air for another 11 hours, even without flight refueling. Graceful touchdown from a graceful aeroplane. And here's the welcoming committee, and here's the rear gunner. Well, this is the first time that Westerners have been allowed on board an aircraft which, for 40 years, intelligence has been spending time and probably millions of pounds trying to look at the inside of. And here we are aboard the Bear. Hello, nice to see you.
Hello, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Behind this bulkhead, there's room for 6 cruise missiles. Well, Major, could you just take me through the controls?
Здесь находится, значит, место командира корабля, штурвал.
Major Govalenko was explaining that this 188-ton Bear has conventionally boosted flight controls. For the pilot, there's an autopilot in the center, and for his normal position as the co-pilot. He said it was a reasonably conventional aircraft to fly. Can I give you the BBC? Right.
And here's an exchange of badges of special significance. BBC just happens to be the initials of the Russian Air Force. The English Electric, later BAC Lightning, was a sensational aeroplane from all points of view. Powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Avons with reheat generating some 30,000 pounds of thrust, it became the RAF's first genuinely supersonic all-weather squadron fighter. It succeeded, great opportunities were missed, but it was a sensational aeroplane. But here is the frontline fighter of today's Royal Air Force, the Tornado F-3, the air defense version of the swing-wing MRCA multi-role combat aircraft, 2 seats in tandem, capable of over 900 miles an hour at sea level and over 1,300 miles an hour at height. Designed, developed and built by Panavia, the multinational partnership between Britain, Germany and Italy, and the Turbo Union turbofans with reheat are the product of a specially formed company involving the same 3 countries. The Tornado F-3 was built to intercept strategic bombers or cruise missiles during the Cold War, but it has already proved its value to the RAF in the changed circumstances of today.
A few years ago, Tornadoes would have been on opposing sides to MiG-21s. Today, they provide the welcoming escort for the world's newest aerobatic team, the Hungarian Sky Hussars. The Russian-built MiG-21 entered service in 1958
before the Lightning, but it still flies with more than 30 air forces around the world.
And Hungary has just over 100 of these short-range interceptors. Despite only weighing 10 tons on takeoff, the MiG-21 needs all the power available in its two-man sky turbojet for air combat maneuvers and flight up to Mach 2.1. That engine's very thirsty, particularly as most of the maneuvers are executed using the afterburner. The cockpits, like most Russian aircraft, are painted green inside, which is supposed to be soothing. And considering the lack of forward visibility, they probably need all the soothing they can get.
This display is simulating a dogfight with a solo pilot, a combat team of 2 Angels, and a bandit. These pilots fly for only 80 hours a year, and they spent just 10 hours rehearsing this display.
Organising what's claimed to be the world's biggest display of military aircraft both on the ground and in the air is no mean feat. It takes months of preparation and careful planning.
Yes, everybody has to good.
Before the flying display gets underway, the pilots who come from all over the world gather for a briefing, which obviously includes the all-important weather forecast.
As you can see, through to around 10 o'clock this morning, I'm expecting the cloud base to vary between about 500 or 600 feet.
It takes months of planning to decide which aircraft goes when, where and for how long. It's flying display manager Ken Bagley's job to get the air show off the ground.
Each display has got an allocated slot and they must stick to that. If they don't, obviously it's got a back-on effect leading on to everybody else in the display. And we work on very tight minimums. As soon as one aircraft is landing, the next is lining up and ready to go. And there is never a time throughout the day when there isn't something in the air or on the runway.
Right, you've got a call sign.
Precision planning isn't only necessary for the display itself. It's an enormous task just to get the 500 or so aircraft in and out of the site, both before and after the event.
I'm a flight operations manager, so I'm responsible for rehearsal slots, slots for getting in, slots for getting out, and all the air movement signals that go with those sort of departures and arrivals.
What kind of problems do you face?
Numbers. Numbers of aircraft that are coming in, and very tight slots for getting the aircraft in and again getting them out. Everybody wants to come in at the same time. Everybody wants to go out at the same time.
06, if you'd like to continue to the end and make a left turn.
Orchestrating aircraft movement is air traffic control, who on the day put the carefully prepared schedules into effect. Everyone hopes that it all goes according to plan.
Unfortunately, yesterday it didn't. The flying display was marred by a mid-air collision involving these 2 MiG-29s from the Russian Flight Test Institute at Zhukovsky near Moscow. It came towards the end of a superb display, which we'll show you now. Mercifully, the crews escaped with only minor injuries, but we should warn you that these are vividly detailed pictures, and if you don't wish to see them, please come back to us in about 4 minutes' time. Flown by 2 test pilots from the Institute, the MiG pair initially performed in tight formation, showing off the superb handling characteristics of one of the world's best fighter aircraft. Painted in yellow, blue and black colour scheme of the pre-revolutionary Russian military aviation, the display was all we've come to expect from these airmen and these aircraft, which first appeared in Britain 5 years ago at the Farnborough Air Show. then performed a series of opposition manoeuvres. And they included in their repertoire the dramatic tail slide. That then led into a parallel loop, and it was in the middle of this that the collision occurred. With incredible reactions, both pilots banged out instantly, while their machines were engulfed in a fireball. Miraculously, they crashed on the edge of the airfield without causing any serious damage.
But let's look again at those dramatic moments with the benefit of slow motion. This MiG, flown by Alexander Bestyeznov, appears to slice the aircraft of Sergei Trozoyetsky. Sergei's aircraft fireballs, falling to earth, with debris hitting a nearby parked Belgian Hercules. Viewed from another angle, we now follow Alexander's MiG and see him eject almost immediately after impact. There goes his rocket. Viewed from a third angle, the impact is clearly visible. Yet it appears that Sergei does not eject for several heart-rending seconds, his MiG already a fireball. There goes his seat now. The parachute deploying. Yet miraculously, both Alexander and Sergei have a cigarette and walk away to fly another day.
Hey, I'll come away in the car. Well, we've seen one half of the RAF's appearance. Now we can have a look at the other. After the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps combined to form the Royal Air Force in 1918, the Navy continued to operate aircraft under the guise of the Fleet Air Arm, which again became a separate identity in 1937. But during the Second World War, the Navy's workhorse was the Fairey Swordfish, or the famous old string bag. The string bag came into service with the Fleet Air Arm in 1936, was outdated by 1939, but remained operational until the end of the war, and was therefore the last biplane to see active service. This particular aircraft is Lima Sierra 326, a Mark II Fairey Swordfish. It's operated by the Royal Navy Historic Flight, based at Yeovilton, one of only two left flying in the world. And I must say, one of the perks of this job is to be able to fly in a wonderful old aircraft like this. It's powered by the Bristol Pegasus 30 radial 9-cylinder engine. They have a crew of 3 with the pilot up front. The observer sits just behind him, and then in the back here, the tail gunner, who would have fired the Vickers K machine gun. Although this particular aircraft never saw active service, it was used as the lead aircraft flying off HMS Ark Royal during the attack on the German battleship Bismarck in the film Sink the Bismarck.
And here's one of the flying boats which served RAF Coastal Command well in the Second World War, the American Consolidated Catalina. In fact, it's an amphibian, as you can see. The exploits credited to the Cats are legion. One found the Bismarck in mid-Atlantic, one attacked a Japanese carrier in daylight after radioing "please inform next of kin," and one set up a world record when it taxied at sea for more than 100 miles in the Far East, too heavily laden with refugees to take off. Astonishingly, over 4,000 in total were built and hundreds served in many countries until long after the war. The de Havilland Mosquito could be described as the original multi-role combat aircraft and resulted from an entirely private venture. The Air Ministry wanted nothing to do with an all-wooden aeroplane. The prototype first flew on the 25th of November 1940, and from it stemmed 7,781 Mosquitoes, powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlins, faster than a Spitfire. It could carry a 4,000-pound bomb. It was the RAF's first really successful night fighter and intruder. It made the Pathfinder force possible. Its coastal command version carried a 6-pounder gun, an epic aeroplane. It performed epic deeds. Hawker Siddeley Buccaneer. Designed as a 2-seat carrier deck striker, it first flew in April 1958. And after the notorious Duncan Sands Defence White Paper of 1957, it was the only new project not suspended or cancelled. And on the very eve of final replacement, the Buccaneers were rushed out to the Gulf War, where they performed brilliantly. And this is the Hawker Siddeley, now British Aerospace Nimrod, and another interesting story. Based on the de Havilland Comet, it was designed to be the world's most sophisticated long-range maritime reconnaissance and anti-submarine aircraft. With 4 Rolls-Royce Spey engines, 2 of which can be shut down in flight on extended patrol, it has a crew of 12 and state-of-the-art detection equipment. Its range is phenomenal. The later AEW version was eventually abandoned, but the Nimrod in its original role is still a valued aircraft in the Royal Air Force.
Well, we saw the Duke of Kent arriving a little earlier. Now another Wessex HCC4 from the Royal Flight based at RAF Benson. And inside His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh visiting International Air to Tu-93. And no doubt His Royal Highness, as a helicopter pilot himself, will be delighted to see the modern-day equivalent of the Royal Flying Corps, the Army Air Corps, who've sent the Silver Eagles to join the party. The Army Air Corps' helicopter demonstration team was born 25 years ago as the Blue Eagles, and their sky blue Sioux helicopters were a familiar sight at air shows around the country. This year the team is made up of volunteer instructors from the Army Air Corps Centre at Middle Wallop, flying 4 Gazelles and a Lynx. Team leader, Captain Colin Dunscombe, putting the Lynx through its paces. Captain Dunscombe had the misfortune to be captured in Kuwait and became part of Saddam Hussein's human shield.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. On behalf of the United States Army Aviation and General Maddox, Commander-in-Chief, United States Army Europe, the United States Army H-64 Apache is proud to participate in the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Royal Air Force. The weapon systems on the H-64 Apache include the Hellfire missile system, 70mm rockets, and a 30mm chain gun that is pointed electronically with the pilot's helmet.
CW4 Robert Watley telling the crowd about the Apache. I must say it's unfortunate that there are no flying displays here at Fairford by the United States Air Force at all, and in fact the only American aircraft being flown by an American is this one from the US Army. It's of particular interest to British eyes because it's one of 3 main contenders to win the MOD contract for about 100 new attack helicopters for the British Army, worth between £2 and £2.5 billion. The and with a new millimetric wave radar, will have the ability to engage and destroy armour up to 8 kilometres away in any weather conditions. The French Air Force has sent la crème de l'aviation de la France, celebrating its 40th birthday, la Patrouille de France. Flying 8 Dassault Advanced Trainer Alpha jets, the team follows a long tradition of aerobatic display flying in France. By the end of last season, they'd logged 113,000 hours in over 1,500 performances, with 136 pilots taking part.
experts and enthusiasts who flock here. All kinds of different people drop in to enjoy not only the flying displays, but the multitude of other things that are on offer.
Around 200 aircraft line the main thoroughfare, stretching over a distance of around 2 miles. Among the international contributors, the Royal Jordanian Air Force, complete with Bedouin tent. Not surprisingly, many of the trade stands and stalls here are crammed with flying paraphernalia, some of it decorative and some of it aimed at the more serious enthusiasts. And if you're tired of traipsing around the huge site or craning your neck to watch the flying displays, there are plenty of alternative ways of getting around.
And now for something completely different. An aerobatic team of transport aircraft, 4 Tupolev L410s of the Czech Air Force. The team started out in 1989 with 3 aircraft. They now have 4. Each has a crew of 3, and they're led by Major Vladimir Randa.
Well, the Czech aircraft manufacturer Let nearly went out of business last year when the Russian airline Aeroflot cancelled a major order, for most of the aircraft had already been built. Luckily, there now appear to be sufficient customers for this rather useful 19-passenger general-purpose transport, and they seem to have secured Let's future. The aircraft have even been modified to have special smoke generators on the back, so they look for all the world as if they were jet aircraft trying to perform at rather slow speed.
And their other onboard equipment includes a powered children's scooter, which has to be one of the best ways of getting around large dispersals. Air forces from around the world have sent aircraft to join the celebrations, and it's marvellous to be able to welcome one of the newest. The Slovak Air Force was only formed on the 1st of January. White Albatross display team has given 12 performances already this year, but this is their first visit to the United Kingdom. They arrived at Fairford via RAF Manston in Kent, where they were impressed by the length and width of the runway. And they admired too the green country and castles as they flew low level to Fairford.
The team flies the Aero L-39C Albatross jet trainer, and hence the name. And that aircraft is built next door in the Czech Republic. But for 20 years now, it's been the most widely used trainer in service with nearly 30 countries around the world. They're even looking for a new version to be powered by the American Garrett engine in place of the Ukrainian Progress turbofan. And this is going to build on sales successes in the Far East. So there you have the first UK performance of the White Albatross from the Slovak Republic.
And more from the Czech Air Force. Czech pilots have poked fun at the NATO codename for this rather evil-looking close air support fighter. NATO called it Frogfoot, so the Czechs painted a hammer-wielding frog cartoon on the tail.
It's a Russian design that was actually first detected by spy satellite. It's got some remarkable design features, including the capability of its engines to use almost any fuel that's available on the battlefield, tank diesel or even petrol. It can take 4 tons of bombs underneath those wings.
Regular visitors to the International Air Tattoo since 1985. Team Aguirre flies the Casa C-101 Aviojet, and the pilots are all instructors at the Spanish Air Force Academy near Murcia. Became instructors, every team member has flown frontline fighter aircraft and has in excess of 2,000 hours experience. Is hoping to sell an improved version of the Aviojet to America to fulfill the current US Air Force and Navy requirements for an advanced trainer. Now this mirror formation with a rolling third aircraft is an intriguing combination and particularly difficult to fly. It requires one aircraft to formate on the inverted machine, around which a third member of the team executes a barrel roll. Now every team has its own particular signature, and for Team Agia it's the formation landing with the rear element touching down first. So conditions not quite as nice as they were earlier on in the day, and it's really been a hectic afternoon for all the volunteers inside the control tower, controlling the biggest flying display ever, which has been enjoyed by so many people here. But they have put up with some pretty horrible weather. Yesterday morning it was absolutely tipping down, and it's not very nice again now. But it's been perhaps the biggest possible operation for the local police. Many people tried to get in yesterday. They queued for up to 5 hours outside and still couldn't get in. I know of one person who started queuing outside at about 9 o'clock and turned home at 2 o'clock. But hopefully they've all managed to get in today.
Perhaps it could be said that the RAF was slow to appreciate the necessity for purpose-built transport aircraft. Modified bombers, as exemplified in Alcock and Brown's first transatlantic crossing, were considered adequate. And I wonder if this Dragon Rapide was the first essentially transport aircraft which the service acquired in, would you believe, 1935? Perhaps they were influenced by the fact that the then Prince of Wales, later the uncrowned King Edward VIII, bought one for his personal use. At any rate, it is significant that when we went to war in 1939, it was an American aircraft, the great Douglas DC-3 Dakota, which became the workhorse of the Allied Air Forces.
We are grateful that today it is flown by a commercial operation, Air Atlantique, who still find it a viable proposition in terms of pollution control, photo recce, joyrides, charter work for freight passengers and other realistic enterprises 58 years after it first flew. What a great aeroplane to fly. I came to it as an ex-fighter pilot, was proud to taxi it into places like Malta and Naples after its history. The Dakota served on every front in the Second World War, from the Arctic to the Arakan. It carried paratroops, stores, VIPs, guns, and even mules. It sustained beleaguered garrisons when they had no other hope of survival. It was flown, as at Arnhem, by gallant men in support of heroes.
The Dakota of today is the ubiquitous and aptly named Hercules, the willing workhorse of air forces around the world. I have rather mixed memories of being huddled in the back of one of these for 3 hours low level with 60 other paratroopers. At the end of that, we couldn't wait to get out. The parachute display teams of the Royal Air Force and the Royal New Zealand Air Force, the Falcons and Kiwi Blue, have rather less cramped accommodation, and they're here purely to entertain the huge RAF Fairford crowd. So first away, it's Kiwi Blue with team leader Flight Lieutenant Seven Smith, all parachute jumping instructors from the Royal New Zealand Air Force Parachute School. The parachute display team of the Royal Air Force, the Falcons, and away they go, led by team leader Flight Lieutenant Alex Jones.
Stay, can't you see that I wanna fall from the stars straight into your arms? Wanna fall
Continuing the story of RAF Transport Command, Squadron Leader Nigel Wilson will now put the Lockheed C-130 turboprop through its paces. With its short takeoff and landing, the Hercules is designed to operate from remote and unprepared strips, and has frequently done so in numerous highly successful famine relief operations around the world, such as Ethiopia and Somalia, for instance. But these Hercules from RAF Lynham in Wiltshire are now involved in much more dangerous operations as they daily brave the threat of hostile fire to bring relief to the troubled peoples of Croatia and Bosnia. They tend to push the aircraft to its considerable limits, flying in and out of Sarajevo. The RAF's strategic transport needs are met by the Lockheed TriStar, which came into service in 1984, and the older VC-10. Both are now used as tankers, as well as maintaining their passenger and freight carrying roles. The Hercules too is involved in tanking. Air-to-air refuelling is a skill that was developed before the Second World War by Sir Alan Cobham of flying circus fame, but it didn't become a regular operational procedure until the 1960s, and indeed there are still less than a dozen countries that have the capability. Famously, it allowed a Vulcan to bomb the runway at Port Stanley during the Falklands War, having flown for 4,000 miles. And directly as a result of that, the Hercules fleet was modified to allow them to fly anywhere in the world. But while having the ability to go non-stop to
Aircraft
Australia...
enthusiasts will travel hundreds, even thousands of miles to be close to the action. This campsite is full of devoted plane spotters. They're sleeping in tents, caravans, even cars, to make sure they don't miss a jot of what's going on next door.
Sleeping on the doorstep is the only guarantee of getting into the ground early enough to bag the best seat from which to spot. Events like this are a plane spotter's dream, even if it means roughing it.
Well, I'm staying here, I'm staying in here, in the Ladder Hotel. I brought it down from Scotland on Wednesday, and I've been sleeping in it for 4 nights.
Why do you do it?
I don't know. Anything up in the sky. I used to bird watch. I think there's something about flight that just turns me on. It's nice, exciting.
Like the noise, like the spectacle, just like the feeling of being around aeroplanes.
Britain and Holland nurture more fanatical plane spotters than every other nation put together. To the bewilderment of those on the outside, the most devoted travel around the world in pursuit of their passion. When face to face with the aircraft, the fans take photos and note aircraft numbers, where the planes come from, and who the pilot is. This year's air show is said to be the most important event in the plane spotting calendar, and to the dedicated, it couldn't be missed for the world.
The prize for the most travelled visitors must go to numbers 1 and 6 squadrons of the Royal Australian Air Force. This F-111C took a week to get here, staging through Fiji, Hawaii, the continental United States and Canada. Its pilot, squadron leader David Coote, has nearly 2,000 hours on F-111s, while his navigator, squadron leader Rick Owen, has an even greater pedigree. His father flew on Lancasters, Canberras and F-111s. It's capable of speeds in excess of Mach 2.5, over 2.5 times the speed of sound, and it's also capable of torching. By dumping fuel between the jet exhausts and lighting the reheat, there have apparently been reports of UFOs over Brisbane. They use about 1,500 pounds of fuel in that one pass. Last of the formation display teams, but by no means the least, are the Aermacchi MB339 Pans of the Italian Air Force, the Frecce Tricolori. In their 33rd display season, the Three Coloured Arrows are the largest full-time aerobatic display team in the world. Based at Rivolto near Venice, they're led by Colonel Giampaolo Menescalo, or Pony One, who's been on the team since 1986. While most pilots recognise the Red Arrows as being the ultimate professionals in the formation display game, the Frecce Tricolori bring a certain Latin flair that makes them one of the highlights of any show. These dashing Italian aviators have huge appeal in their own country. In fact, there are 29 special fan clubs there, as well as, curiously, one in Canada.
Giusta la mia. Fuori, voilà. Stanno Toscanella.
Ok, fai in 2-3. Lungo 1.
Now for the saga of the bombers of the Royal Air Force, which goes back, of course, to the First World War and the formation of the service. But although this is almost certainly the oldest RAF bomber still flying, this two-seat biplane dates from the period between the wars. Another splendid aircraft produced by the incomparable Sidney Cam, this is the Hawker Hind of 1934. But this aircraft, the Bristol Blenheim, elevated the RAF bomber into a new generation, and its origin is as fascinating as its history is gallant. This is the last in the world still flying, thanks to the incredible tenacity of a small group of dedicated enthusiasts led by Graham Warner. After 12 years' work, they got it flying, and within weeks I saw it crash at Denham. That was 6 years ago, and now they've done it all again. A story itself worthy of the aircraft's history and of the gallant men who defied all the odds to fly it against the enemy in the darkest days of the war. It was the air-minded newspaper magnate Lord Rothermere who shook up the Air Ministry with his request for a private version which created the Blenheim.
Accompanied by the roar of the 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins, the Avro Lancaster, the RAF Memorial Flight's cherished symbol of the awesome might of Bomber Command in the Second World War. It stands for the Wellingtons and Whitleys and Hamdens that went before it, and the Stirlings and Halifaxes which flew beside it. Above all, it stands for the thousands of brave young men who flew in Bomber Command. Deliveries began in early 1942, and in all over 7,000 were built. But this is the last Lancaster in the world still flying, in the safe hands of squadron leader Andy Tomerlin and his crew. Perhaps the Lancaster raid most famous is that of 50 years ago, when 617 Squadron dropped the Barnes-Wallis bouncing bomb in the Dambusters raid after months of intensive experiment and training.
Despite its size, the crew of 7 were squeezed into their accommodation, not least the lowly tail-end Charlie in his power-operated rear turret. Equally cramped, despite his key role, was the navigator, as Jack Jones of 617 Squadron will never forget. It wasn't exactly a comfortable ride, Jack.
Certainly not, no. It was very cramped and extremely cold.
And very frightening?
Well, yes.
From time to time?
Sometimes.
How many raids did you fly, Jack?
Altogether 54.
Pretty good score.
With 617, 24.
And what was the most outstanding one?
Well, the most prestigious raid was when we led 318 Lancasters to Berchtesgaden. That was the last raid of the war over Germany. And
you were the lead navigator?
We were the leading crew, yes.
But you were doing the navigating and leading all the rest?
Indeed.
You're too modest, Jack. That's what you do.
Yes, that's true. That's quite true.
And here's another major milestone in our story, the English Electric Canberra.
Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, Chief Test Pilot of English Electric, pilots the latest version of the Canberra jet bomber, which is now going into production for the RAF.
The Canberra was so far ahead of its time, the Americans bought it. The onset of the Cold War in the early 50s confronted the Royal Air Force with its greatest challenge. What was required was a new force to carry the nuclear deterrent, the V bombers. The Vickers Valiant, the product of Sir George Edwards and his brilliant team at Wisley. Sadly not flying in this 75th anniversary celebration, but seen here 2 years ago, the most famous of the V bombers, the unforgettable Falcon, the huge delta shape which was a showstopper whenever it appeared. It was the Falcon which made history with its 8,000-mile raid to bomb the runway at Port Stanley during the Falklands campaign. We move on now to the 70s, and like Concorde, an example of successful, if difficult, Anglo-French cooperation. This is the Jaguar, designed and developed by British Aircraft Corporation and Dassault Breguet to meet a joint requirement of the RAF and the French Air Force for a single-seat, all-weather ground attacker with a two-seat dual-control variant. just subsonic, packing a terrific punch. The Jaguar is a great success. But this aircraft, the Tornado GR-1A, must be the Royal Air Force star in its 75th year. We have already seen its fighter counterpart, but this is the successor to the lineage of RAF bombers. It won headlines and world admiration in the Gulf War.
And in honour of 75 years, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight leads a final flypast of some of the RAF's great aircraft. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Raymond Baxter is almost as old as the Royal Air Force, but is proud still to be flying with them. He's on board the Lancaster.
If ever there was a flying shrine to courage, you join me there now. In these confined spaces, brave men fought and died. The history of the Royal Air Force is punctuated by great names, both within and without the service. Some defied the politicians, some defied the accepted rules of technology, some defied the enemy in the face of fearful odds. But the people who made the Royal Air Force what it was and is today are anonymous. They are the men and women who were and still are prepared to serve and simply go on doing the job in hand to the best of their ability, whatever the circumstances and however great the cost.